In the quiet suburbs of London, commuters stepped onto buses every morning, rarely giving a second thought to the driver behind the wheel. For many, he was just another face in uniform, polite, punctual, a man who blended seamlessly into the daily rhythm of the city. His name was Jesús Ruiz-Henao, and to neighbors and passengers alike, he was nothing more than a hard-working family man. But beneath that ordinary facade lay one of the most extraordinary double lives in recent British crime history. Ruiz-Henao wasn't just driving buses. He was secretly running a cocaine empire worth an estimated £1 billion. Born in Colombia, Ruiz-Henao grew up in a country synonymous with the cocaine trade. By the time he arrived in the UK, he had cultivated the quiet discipline of a man who knew how to stay invisible. He worked as a bus driver, lived modestly, and kept a low profile. On paper, there was nothing to suggest he was a criminal mastermind. Yet behind closed doors, he was carefully constructing one of the most sophisticated smuggling networks the country had ever seen. His connections stretched back to Colombia's cartels and forward through the arteries of Europe's black market trade. From ports and warehouses to hidden supply chains, Ruiz-Henao orchestrated a system that brought tons of cocaine into Britain, much of it disguised as fruit shipments and food cargo. The genius of his method lay not just in the concealment, but in the cover story he built around himself. Who would ever suspect a bus driver? His salary explained his modest lifestyle, while his wealth remained hidden in offshore accounts, properties, and assets disguised under the names of relatives. Those who knew him personally described him as calm, even friendly. He smiled at neighbors, waved at passengers, and returned home quietly each night. There were no flashy cars parked in his driveway, no expensive jewelry on display. He played his role so well that for years, nobody realized the truth. By day, he navigated city streets with passengers aboard. By night, he controlled one of the largest cocaine pipelines in the UK. And like all carefully balanced double lives, it was only a matter of time before cracks began to show. The rise of Jesús Ruiz-Henao, from an anonymous bus driver to the architect of a billion-pound smuggling empire, didn't happen overnight. It began quietly, with the careful steps of a man who understood both patience and trust. His Colombian roots gave him a natural entry point. Through family connections and acquaintances from his homeland, Ruiz-Henao tapped into the cocaine supply chain at its source. By the late 2000s, Britain was becoming one of Europe's most lucrative drug markets, and demand was skyrocketing. Colombian cartels needed reliable middlemen on the ground, people who could move their product into Europe without attracting attention. Ruiz-Henao was perfectly placed to fill that role. At first, his operations were small. He recruited trusted individuals within the UK, people who, like him, could pass as ordinary workers, truck drivers, warehouse laborers, dock employees. These were his foot soldiers. He promised them good money for simple tasks: move a container, sign off a delivery, look the other way. Each task seemed harmless on its own, but collectively, they kept the machine running smoothly. The shipments came hidden in everyday goods, pallets of fruit juice, tins of produce, even legitimate food containers arriving at UK ports. To the untrained eye, the cargo looked routine, but within, concealed behind false walls or sealed in custom-made cans, lay bricks of high-purity cocaine. To reinforce his cover, Ruiz-Henao registered legitimate businesses that operated in import and export. On paper, he was just another businessman trading in goods. In reality, these companies served as a front, their invoices and cargo manifests crafted to disguise the true contents of shipments. By the early 2010s, his system was working with ruthless efficiency. Customs checks often passed over his cargo, distracted by other targets or reassured by the legitimacy of his paperwork. Ruiz-Henao had mastered the art of being invisible, and in the shadows, his network was beginning to grow. For those around him, nothing had changed. He was still the same polite bus driver, but in hidden warehouses and shipping yards, he was building the foundations of an empire that would soon flood Britain with staggering amounts of cocaine. By the mid-2010s, the small-scale smuggling operations that Jesús Ruiz-Henao had built were no longer enough. Demand for cocaine in Britain was soaring, and he saw an opportunity to expand far beyond anything he had managed before. What had started as clever concealment inside food shipments was about to transform into a full-scale industrial operation. The method that defined his empire became infamous: cocaine hidden inside pineapple juice cans and fruit shipments. Entire containers arrived at UK ports looking completely legitimate. Each box bore genuine branding, every can sealed and labelled as if it had come straight from a factory. But within, tens of millions of pounds worth of cocaine was pressed, packaged, and disguised to pass unnoticed through customs. The ports of entry became crucial to his success. Locations like London Gateway, Portsmouth, and Felixstowe were flooded daily with containers from across the world. Amid thousands of legitimate goods, Ruiz-Henao's consignments blended in perfectly. His paperwork, backed by his front companies, was impeccable. Shipping records looked normal, and the products matched invoices to the letter. Once inside the UK, the cargo was moved into discreet warehouses, some in London, others in the Midlands. Here, trusted lieutenants unloaded, repackaged, and prepared the drugs for distribution. The cocaine was then filtered into regional supply chains, handed off to mid-level gangs who broke it down into street deals. Ruiz-Henao kept his distance, never handling the drugs directly, instead orchestrating everything through layers of intermediaries. This separation made him hard to catch. He wasn't on the streets, and he wasn't a flashy gangster flaunting wealth. He was the man in the shadows, the quiet coordinator whose empire was moving hundreds of kilos at a time. Each shipment could fetch tens of millions on the street, and soon his operation was estimated at over £1 billion in value. To maintain control, Ruiz-Henao built ties with European traffickers, particularly Dutch intermediaries, who specialized in moving large shipments across borders. The network became transnational, stretching from Colombia to Britain, via Spain, Holland, and Belgium. From the outside, he was still the same bus driver, but by now, he had become one of the most powerful cocaine traffickers operating in Britain. His empire had reached its peak, and with that scale came scrutiny that even his careful planning could not avoid. On the surface, Jesús Ruiz-Henao still lived like the man everyone thought he was, a quiet bus driver, earning a modest wage, blending into the fabric of his neighborhood. But behind that facade, his life was very different. The profits from his cocaine empire were astronomical, and though he kept much of it hidden, the cracks in his double life began to show. Investigators would later uncover that Ruiz-Henao owned multiple properties, both in Britain and abroad. Some were held under relatives' names, others through shell companies designed to keep his fingerprints off the paperwork. In Colombia, he had investments that spoke of wealth far beyond what a transport worker could ever accumulate. Though he avoided the ostentation of typical drug lords, Ruiz-Henao still indulged in the spoils of his empire. He traveled internationally, flying under the radar while enjoying holidays funded by drug money. Expensive clothes and discreet luxury items began to fill his wardrobe. He drove vehicles that far exceeded the means of an ordinary bus driver, though they were often registered under associates to reduce suspicion. The media would later dub him the budget Pablo Escobar, not because he lacked ambition, but because he deliberately kept his lifestyle understated. Where Escobar flaunted his billions with palaces and zoos, Ruiz-Henao masked his fortune behind a working man's cover, choosing subtlety over spectacle. But even careful men leave traces. Financial investigators noticed unusual transactions, large sums being laundered through businesses that seemed too small to justify the cash flow. Luxury goods purchased in cash raised eyebrows when traced back, and as his network grew, it became harder to keep every associate quiet. Whispers about his true wealth began to circulate in criminal circles. For the public, however, nothing seemed unusual. He was still the man behind the wheel of a bus, greeting passengers with a nod. No one imagined that after his shift, he returned not to a simple life but to an empire worth £1 billion. The contrast between his public image and his hidden fortune was razor sharp, and it was this delicate balance, appearing ordinary while living extraordinary, that would eventually start to unravel. By the late 2010s, Britain's law enforcement agencies were growing increasingly uneasy. Cocaine seizures at ports were rising, and patterns began to emerge. Shipments disguised as fruit juice, vegetables, or other food imports appeared too frequently to be coincidence. Somewhere, a large-scale network was exploiting the system with remarkable precision. The National Crime Agency, NCA, working alongside Border Force, quietly began piecing together the puzzle. They noticed recurring names on shipping documents, front companies registered with vague business purposes, and consignments routed through the same ports. Each clue on its own seemed minor, but together they painted a troubling picture. Surveillance operations were launched. Ruiz-Henao's movements came under scrutiny. Detectives followed him as he drove from his bus routes to meetings with men tied to warehouses and shipping firms. They tapped into communications, intercepting fragments of encrypted messages that hinted at vast shipments and coded references to fruit or juice. The breakthrough came when authorities intercepted a shipment of fruit juice cans at a UK port. Hidden inside were blocks of cocaine, meticulously packed. The packaging was identical to crates that had passed through undetected before. Forensic checks traced the supply chain back to companies linked to Ruiz-Henao. From that moment, the focus tightened. The NCA began mapping his empire, the warehouses he used, the intermediaries he trusted, the routes his cargo took. They saw how cocaine flowed from Colombia into Europe, then through Dutch and Spanish intermediaries, before being funneled into Britain under Ruiz-Henao's control. As the investigation closed in, cracks in his armor began to appear. Ruiz-Henao grew paranoid. He changed phones frequently, altered his travel patterns, and limited direct contact with some associates. But his empire was too vast to keep entirely hidden. The sheer volume of cocaine moving through British ports left trails that even the most sophisticated cover couldn't erase. For the first time, investigators were confident they had identified the man at the center of the billion-pound pipeline. He was still behind the wheel of his bus, still nodding politely at passengers, but now every movement was being watched. The net was tightening, and soon it would close. In early 2021, after months of surveillance and meticulous planning, the NCA made its move. Coordinated raids were launched across London and the Midlands, targeting warehouses, safe houses, and the modest home where Jesús Ruiz-Henao lived his double life. When officers entered his property, they found a man who looked every bit the bus driver he claimed to be. Quiet, composed, almost unsuspecting. But the evidence seized elsewhere told a very different story. Inside warehouses tied to his network, investigators uncovered hundreds of kilos of cocaine, packed in crates identical to those previously tracked through ports. The street value ran into the tens of millions. Alongside the drugs, officers recovered financial documents, shipping records, and encrypted communication devices that laid bare the structure of Ruiz-Henao's empire. His legitimate businesses were exposed as elaborate fronts, their glossy paperwork hiding the flow of cartel product into Britain. Traces of laundered money were tracked through shell companies and bank accounts spread across Europe and South America. The trial that followed drew widespread attention. How could a man who spent his days behind the wheel of a London bus secretly control a billion-pound cocaine empire? Prosecutors laid out the story step by step. The shipments disguised as pineapple juice, the warehouses serving as hubs, the money funneled into offshore accounts. Forensic experts explained how the packaging of seized cocaine matched consignments linked to Ruiz-Henao's network. The defense attempted to downplay his role, arguing that he was a small cog in a much larger machine, not the mastermind prosecutors portrayed. But the sheer weight of evidence was overwhelming. Witnesses, surveillance logs, financial trails, and physical seizures all pointed to the same conclusion. Ruiz-Henao was at the center of it all. In the end, the jury was convinced. Ruiz-Henao was found guilty of importing vast quantities of cocaine and running one of the UK's most significant drug trafficking enterprises. The judge, describing the operation as staggering in its scale and sophistication, handed down a long custodial sentence, ensuring the so-called bus driver drug lord would spend decades behind bars. The mask had finally slipped, and the ordinary man behind the wheel was revealed as one of Britain's most prolific smugglers. In the immediate aftermath, the collapse of Ruiz-Henao's network was swift. His warehouses were seized, assets frozen, and dozens of his close associates either arrested or forced underground. Cocaine shipments linked to his organization dried up temporarily, creating ripples in the UK drug market. Mid-level gangs suddenly found themselves without supply, sparking turf struggles and new alliances as others rushed to fill the vacuum. Law enforcement hailed the case as a major success. The National Crime Agency described it as one of the most significant blows to organized crime in recent years, proof that even the most carefully hidden networks could be dismantled. At press conferences, officials stressed the importance of international cooperation, pointing out that Ruiz-Henao's empire had spanned Colombia, Spain, the Netherlands, and Britain. Without collaboration across borders, they said, he might never have been brought down. But there were also notes of caution. Experts warned that while Ruiz-Henao's arrest was a triumph, the cocaine trade itself was too vast to be undone by one conviction. Within months, other groups had begun to patch the supply routes he once controlled. The billion-pound pipeline had been disrupted, not destroyed. Meanwhile, criminologists began dissecting the case in detail. Universities and legal institutes studied how a man with such an ordinary cover could manage such an extraordinary operation. His story was included in courses on organized crime and criminology, highlighting the dangers of underestimating those who live seemingly modest lives. For the wider public, Ruiz-Henao became a cautionary tale, the bus driver drug lord whose friendly smile masked a criminal empire. And for law enforcement, his case became a reminder that in the fight against organized crime, the faces of the masterminds aren't always the ones you expect.